Good morning. What's everybody doing this morning? Hope all is well. Checking here, making sure that we are live. One thing that's interesting, somebody out there may know this, but in the past, Zoom would allow you to publish to Facebook straight to an event that you're running. In the most recent updates to Zoom, for whatever reason, it's almost impossible to publish into the event that we had scheduled. So maybe some of you know how to make that happen. Let me know if you do. Shoot me an email, leave a comment here. Don't know why or how that it's not working. Anyway, you'll see me looking down from time to time. I'm checking the comments here for all the beauty that Zoom is. It unfortunately doesn't show Facebook comments as they come in without looking somewhere else. Jeremy, great to see you, sir. Glad you were doing well. How's everyone's December going? So we're a couple days in. How's it going? Decided to bring my own tea today. This is Earl Grey, one of my favorites. Twinings, I don't know how you say that, Twinings. It's the brand, it's backwards, I think, on the camera. And drinking out of my favorite mug, one of my favorite. I have two favorite. This one is one of them. The other is from a coffee roaster out of Santa Barbara, California. All right, so today we're going to be talking about 7 frameworks for 7 figures. And I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. All right, I think you should be able to see the screen here coming up in 1 second. So when we think of business often, we think a lot in terms of strategies and tactics and, the latest, the greatest, the social media things that are going on in the world. But what we don't often think about are the frameworks or the underlying things that are taking place and helping shape or sculpt the decisions that we're making. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. We are going to, thanks, Mark. I appreciate the comment about the gray in the beard. It's from, dealing with clients like you, Mark, that give me the gray. Just kidding. Tori, thanks for joining us. Angela, thanks so much for joining us as well. Celebrating the end of 2020, huh, Tori? Yeah, 2020 for a lot of people obviously has been extremely challenging. What's interesting though is for some people, 2020 has been a great year. We have kind of a mixed bag of clients, meaning some of our clients, 2020 has been phenomenal for their businesses. For others, as you can imagine, it has been very, very challenging and very depressing for a lot of folks out there. And I know that people watching this, some of you will fall in one of those two camps. Either it's been a great year for you or it's not been so great. And I know that Mark shared recently that their company, Extreme Tree Service, has had a great year this year. So if you've had a great year, the question for you becomes, what are the things that took place this year that you can replicate going into 2021? What are the things that made this year great for you? And what can you do to repeat those things going into 2021? For those who haven't had such a great year, your business has struggled this year. Obviously, the pandemic probably had a lot to do with that. The question becomes, how do you pivot going into 2021 based on the new reality that we find ourselves in? How do you actually pivot your company? And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and start diving into this. Let me just make sure that the screen's going to update here. For those who don't know, my name is Wayne. I'm the founder of Ugly Mug Marketing. January will make 12 years that we've been doing this. I love learning. I read a lot, listen to a lot of podcasts, audiobooks. I really have a passion for learning, because I know that if I'm not improving, if I'm not growing each day, then chances are my competitors they're getting better. And so I view it as kind of a competition with myself to make sure that I'm getting a little bit better each and every single day. I have 4 wonderful kids. They age and range from 7 years old up to 13 years old, almost 14. Another couple of months to be 14. I have on here that I hate running, and that's mostly true. I run a lot. I run 6 days a week. And, to be honest with you, I don't necessarily enjoy the process of running. Today was miserable. For those in this area know, it was raining. It was pretty chilly. And every step of the run was miserable, but I did it anyway. And I'm thankful that I did. For me, running is something that, it gives me a little victory every single day. It forces me to do something first thing in the morning that I don't want to do. And I know that if I can get up and make myself do that one thing, that all the other things I have to make myself do throughout the day are actually that much easier. For those familiar with the Enneagram test, I'm an Enneagram 3, very closely followed by a 1. I'm not going to tell you what that means. If you're not familiar with it, you should go look it up, check it out. It's super fascinating stuff. So today, what we're going to cover why 7 figures, what's a framework, what are the 7 frameworks, and then answer any questions you may have. And then I'm going to give you some next steps that you should be taking. I'm going to be looking down from time to time, looking at the comments here. If you've got a question, feel free to interrupt, bring up the question. I'll do my best to answer those in real time as we progress through today. So let's dive in and let's first start with why 7 figures. Is it about the money? What's the point of earning 7 figures in your company? Why does your business need to aim for 7 figures? And the answer is you. It's about who you as a leader have to become to build a 7-figure company. Jim Rohn, motivational speaker from, I guess 60s, 70s, 80s. He's since passed away. But he had a saying that everyone should set a goal to be a millionaire, not for the $1 million, but for the person that you have to become in the process of earning the $1 million. And the same thing is true about a business. In order for your business to reach $1 million in revenue, you have to develop certain skills as a leader. You have to learn how to sell, how to market, how to fulfill, how to keep clients satisfied. All of those things have to be done at scale when you get to 7 figures. And so it forces you to become a better version of who you were when you began your company. So that's the reason. That's the reason that 7 figures matters. It also gives you options. When you have that kind of revenue, if you have your business structured correctly, you should have profit. And those revenues and those profits actually give you opportunities, right? They give you options. It's not like you're having to work just to cover the expenses. You now have opportunities to expand, to look at different avenues. Maybe that means buying competitors out. Maybe that means going into other side businesses that support your main business. But 7 figures and profit that goes along with that gives you that flexibility, and it gives you those options. So what is a framework? A framework is a basic structure underlying a system. Now, that's kind of confusing. It doesn't really mean a lot. So the way I like to think about it is this: when we think about a business and we think about a framework, what we want to think about is the framework is kind of like the train track. So if you think of, you've got a train, and the framework itself is the train track. It's kind of the foundational piece. Now, on top of that, you have strategies and you have tactics that get set on top of those frameworks. And when I think about it in that context, or using that analogy, I think about, okay, the framework are the train tracks. On top of that, I'm going to put the train, and that's the strategy. So for some of you out there, the strategy may mean you have an old steam engine train. For some of you, that means you have a bullet train, right? From Japan, you have a bullet train. For others, you have like a big utility train, like a, one of the ones we see pulling all the cargo down the lines. For some of you, that may mean you have an Amtrak train, right? That pulls a lot of people with you. There's not a right or wrong in terms of what the train is. It's going to vary based on your business, based on your industry, all of those things. So that is the strategy, right? The strategy is the train itself. Now, the tactics would be the way that you actually operate that train, right? The way you maintain the train, the way that you provide service if you have people on your train, the way that you invoice clients, you invoice customers, et cetera. So the framework, again, is the underlying system or structure. And it's rare, from my finding at least, that people talk about the underlying frameworks in business. They often talk about strategies and tactics, which are great. But if you don't have the right underlying frameworks, then the other stuff, the stuff that gets stacked on top of that, doesn't matter. So for today, what I want to do is I want to challenge your thinking, and I want to challenge you to examine the framework that you already have in place, because you already have them in place. Every business, every entrepreneur has frameworks in place. The question is, are those intentional, right? Are the frameworks that you currently have in place, were they put there intentionally, or were they just accidental? In other words, they just happened as you were growing your business and as you were moving along. So framework number one, again, we're going to cover 7 frameworks, so 7 figures. The very first one is what I call the mirror framework. And this, to be honest with you, is the most harsh one, but it's also the most important one. That's why it's the very first one we have here. What is it? So let's start with this quote by Michael Gerber. Michael Gerber wrote a book called E-Myth, E-Myth Revisited, both great books, highly recommend them. And this is the quote: "Your business is nothing more than a distinct reflection of who you are. If your thinking is sloppy, your business will be sloppy. If you are disorganized, your business will be disorganized. If your business is to change, as it must to continue to thrive, you must change first." So he said it. So I'm going to blame the harshness on Michael Gerber, but that is the reality. The reality is that our business is a reflection of who we are as the leaders in our organization, in our company. So I would challenge you to begin self-reflection first. So if your business isn't going the way you wanted, or if your business isn't scaling the way you wanted to scale, begin by looking in the mirror. Don't begin by looking around and pointing the finger. Instead, look first at you. It's that old adage that we were told as kids, that when you point your finger at someone else, there's 3 fingers pointing back at us. And it's so true when it comes to business and the frameworks that we have in place. The very first framework is, it's all about us. Our business is a reflection of us. And until we embrace that, until we understand that framework, the other frameworks aren't going to make a difference, because we're always going to be blaming other people. We're always going to be blaming our circumstances, and we're never going to own the responsibility for the outcomes in our business. Let's keep moving here. Here are some tips on the framework. Don't settle for easy questions. Seek the truth in all areas. And these questions, when you seek the truth, when you dive into why is the business producing the results that it's producing, it should make you uncomfortable. It should make you uncomfortable when you do that. And you have to be intentional about your development as a leader. You have to be intentional about facing the brutal facts about who you are as a leader and what you need to do to get better as a leader. Framework number 2. So these next few frameworks we're going to talk about all have to do with culture, building the culture in your company, as well as communication. So those 2 things overlap, and they overlap in such a way that when you find an organization or business that has a poor culture, I would be willing to bet you will discover an organization or company that has poor communication, whether that's internally or externally. So both of those things are going to combine in terms of communication. But again, if you find a company with a bad culture, a terrible company culture, you are going to find a company with bad communication. In other words, they don't know how to communicate internally nor externally. So framework 2 is implicit versus explicit framework. Well, all right, here we go. So all the communication in your organization falls into two categories, either implicit or explicit. So what are those two things? So explicit is clearly stated in detail, leaving no room for confusion or doubt. And then implicit is implied, though not plainly expressed. Now, as leaders, we all too often believe that we are very explicit in our communication. But the reality is, most of our communication is actually implicit. It's actually implied. And this is where we get in trouble as leaders. We get in trouble when we assume that we made something very clear, that we were explicit in our communication, when instead it was implied. So when you think about, for example, showing up on time at work, you may assume that you were very explicit about your team showing up on time. But the reality is you may have just simply implied that it was important. And so when there's a communication breakdown, the very first thing you need to do is you need to ask yourself, was what I believed I communicated, was it implicit or explicit? Again, you can't hold people to high expectations if they don't clearly understand what those expectations are. And that's why it's so important that you and I as leaders examine our communication and understand, were we explicit or were we implicit with that communication? Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong thing here and it jumps back. So sorry about that. Clear communication isn't about what is said, but it is about what is understood. I'm gonna say that again because it's very important. Clear communication isn't about what is said, it's about what is understood. So when we communicate, it's not about the words that come out of our mouth. It's not even about the nonverbal communication cues or clues that we're using to communicate. What it is about is what is being understood by the person or people on the other end of our communication. That is what clear communication is about. So you may think you're doing a great job of communicating. I may sit here and think I'm doing a great job of communicating with you, but the reality is it's what you are understanding. You're the determining factor in terms of how clearly I'm communicating. In this case, the 7 frameworks, right? So when you go to your team, you have to make sure that you are clearly communicating. Here's some questions. So when you're frustrated by the lack of understanding from people on your team, from lack of understanding from your vendors or from your customers, the question is, how was it communicated? Was it explicit? Was it implicit? What was actually understood? And here's the thing, you and I don't get to be the judge of what was understood, right? It's the people actually listening to us that get to be the judge of that. So what did they actually understand? Then you need to ask yourself, what exactly is it that I'm frustrated over, right? What is the thing that I'm frustrated over? There's a great phrase or quote that I love to use. It's when furious, get curious. So when you're frustrated, when you're furious about something, get curious. Question, did I clearly communicate this? What did I attempt to communicate? And then what did they actually understand? And here's what we often discover is when we get frustrated over something, chances are very good that it was a lack of clear communication that was the result of that, right? That's the thing often behind our frustration is that we didn't clearly communicate what we thought we were communicating. Good morning to Patricia. Thanks so much for joining us. And Bobby, thanks for joining us. Let's keep on moving forward here. So the third framework is trust versus suspicion. Now, keep in mind that we are talking about communication right now because communication defines and determines the culture that we build in our organization. And as Peter Drucker said, he said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. In other words, culture is far, far more important than the actual strategy that you have in place. And so what I'm giving you today are these frameworks, these underlying things that will help you build out this great culture. These 7 frameworks will help you build a culture of high accountability, self-accountability, and high performance. So what is trust versus suspicion? Every time you give your word, whether explicit or implicit, you are either building trust or suspicion. You're building one of those 2 things every single time you give your word. So trust is at the foundation of a good culture. Without trust, you cannot build a great culture. So here's some interesting things when we think about trust versus suspicion. When we give our word that we're going to do something, okay? So let's just say that I give my word that I'm going to have something to someone on our team by a certain day and a certain time. Well, if I deliver whatever that is to them on time and what I said I would deliver, what have I just done? I've further built trust in that relationship. Now, what happens if I don't deliver it on time? Or what happens if I do deliver it on time, but it's not what I communicated I would deliver? I have now begun building suspicion. I've now begun giving them reasons to doubt whether or not they can trust you or trust me to do what I say I'm going to do when I say I'm going to do it. We judge others based on their actions, but we judge ourselves based on our intentions. And that is why it's so tricky. And that is why it's so important that we really think through this every time we give our word. Because when we give our word, like I'm going to have something to you by this time in this day, right? And then something comes up and I don't do that, I'm going to judge myself based on my intentions. Well, I intended to have that over to you. However, X, Y, and Z happened, right? There was a quote unquote valid reason that I didn't get that over to you. But the other person, they're not going to judge us based on our intentions. They're going to judge us based on our actions. Did we actually deliver on what we said we were going to do? So you need to ask. I have to constantly ask, what am I building? Am I building trust or am I building suspicion? And for those of you leading a team, it's important that this is an ongoing conversation. This can't be a one-time conversation. This can't be a conversation that just takes place in passing. The trust versus suspicion conversation is a conversation that should take place on a very regular basis. Again, trust is the foundation for a good company culture. And interestingly enough, I was listening to a podcast by, I can't remember his first name. It's Stephen Covey's son. I can't remember his first name. So his last name's Covey. And he wrote a book called The Speed of Trust, I believe is the name of the book. And he was on a podcast and they were talking about it. And he was saying that when we continually violate or break the promises that we make to others and to ourselves, we no longer are even able to trust ourselves. And when we're unable to trust ourselves, we have no foundation for self-confidence. And so his whole premise was that all of self-confidence is built on your ability to live with integrity to yourself. In other words, do you keep the word that you give on a consistent basis? And what's so interesting about that is it is one of the most difficult things to do. When we're brutally honest, when we go back to framework number 1, which is the mirror framework, when we're willing to look in that mirror and be brutally honest with ourselves, it is very difficult conversations that we have to have, right? We have to be honest with ourselves about, am I building trust or am I building suspicion? Am I keeping my word when I give my word? So let's keep rolling forward here. Trust versus suspicion, extremely important. Highly recommend continuing conversation. The next one is results, not reason. Now, this ties into framework number 2, number 3. These all fit together very nicely, and they build on top of each other. Results, not reasons. There's always a reason, and often they're valid reasons. But results are results. Results are reality. Results alone are the best measure of your confidence, your competence, and your courage. Results and reasons are mutually exclusive. So when I use the word reasons, what am I talking about? I am talking about the fact that when we don't keep our word, we always in our minds have valid reasons we didn't keep our word, right? None of us set out and just say, I'm going to get you this report and then just simply intentionally not give someone the report when we say we're going to give them the report. We always have valid reasons we didn't do what we said we would do. But at the end of the day, it's the results that matter. So when you think about your business, your organization, and the culture that you're building, you have to ask yourself, are we an organization, are we a culture that tolerates reasons, or are we an organization that is solely focused on the results that we're producing, right? Because there's always going to be a reason. This morning, there was plenty of reasons that I didn't want to get up and run this morning, right? Didn't sleep well last night, have some leg pain. It was cold. It was raining. All of those are very valid reasons not to go run. But the truth is, I have a goal for this year that I'm working towards. And we are now in the last, 28 days, 29 days. How many days are left in this year? Not many. And I know that every single day matters towards my running goal. And so even though I had a long list of reasons not to, at the end of the year, those reasons may have cost me the results that I was after. And the same is true in business. The same is true in your organization. Results and reasons are mutually exclusive. The more reasons you have, the more reasons you tolerate from your team for not accomplishing what they set out to accomplish, the fewer results you're going to have. Now, the more results you have, the fewer reasons you're going to have. So they're always mutually exclusive. Remember, it starts with you. You have to be willing to live by this. You can't hold others to a standard that you're unwilling to hold yourself to. I'll say that again. You cannot hold yourself. I cannot hold others to a standard that I'm not willing to hold myself to. We must hold ourselves to higher standards than we're holding those around us to. It's about integrity. It's about being able to look in the mirror knowing that I'm holding myself to at least the same standard, if not higher standard, that I'm expecting of other people. Results must be clearly defined. We can't tell people we want to go in this direction. Instead, we need to say, this is exactly where we're going, and this is exactly the path that we need to be on to get there. Now, the other side of this is reasons must be acknowledged. When someone gives a reason for not doing something, we must have conversation around that reason. We can't simply ignore the reason. In other words, if someone is giving reasons why they didn't accomplish something, why they didn't do something, we have to pause. We have to have conversations. We have to say, okay, those are reasons. And yes, they may be very valid reasons, but those reasons have now directly resulted in you not accomplishing what we set out to accomplish. The next piece of this is use a scoreboard. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. One quick question. What is a favorite sport of yours? What is one of your favorite sports? For me, I used to love watching football. Still do enjoy it. I just don't take the time to do it very often. I just enjoy the fact that, for the most part, it's a high action game, lots of movement. Basketball is another. I always loved watching basketball, both collegiate and professional. Yeah, I'm with you, Patricia. Football is a good one. So let's think about our favorite sport here for a second, whatever yours may be. If you think about your sport that you love, that you like, all of them use scoreboards. Think about every professional sport that comes to mind. Think about Olympic sports. They all tend to have some form of scoreboard. What is the purpose of a scoreboard? Simply, a scoreboard gives us quick and easy access to who's winning, who's losing, and how much time is left. Who's winning, who's losing, how much time is left. And here's the funny thing. The fans, the people around, can easily look up and see what the score is, and they know who's winning, who's losing, and how much time is left. Who else? The players, right? The players, the coaches, the staff, the team, they look at the scoreboard and they can tell who's winning, who's losing, and how much time is left. Now, when we translate that over to our business, how many of us actually have scoreboards in our business? Now, a scoreboard's different than a dashboard. Oftentimes in business, we'll have a dashboard, whether that's a financial dashboard, whether that's a lead flow dashboard that shows us the leads coming in. We may have some different dashboards in our company, but the question is, do we actually have scoreboards? Do we have boards up that enable everyone to see how they're doing and how much time is left? So let's talk about that just a little bit more. This is a very interesting quote. It can be a little bit of a tongue twister here, and I'll explain what it means, but this is it. People will pay for the privilege of working harder than they will work when they are being paid. So I'm gonna say it again. People will pay for the privilege of working harder than they will work when they are being paid. Now, this quote comes from a gentleman by the name of Chuck Coonrent. Chuck Coonrent wrote a book called The Game of Work. And in that book, he basically tells a story about how he was called in to consult with a company. They were a manufacturing company. And, the guy brought him up, kind of the offices overlooked the manufacturing center, and they could look down and kind of observe all the people working. And as they were looking out, the manager basically says, look, here's the problem, look around. And he looks around, he can see people, moving very slowly. They didn't have any energy. They looked all lethargic, right? Not happy to be there. He said, then the interesting thing happened. The lunch bell rang, and all of them, not all of them, but a cluster of these guys, 10 of them, all hurriedly grabbed their lunch pails, went outside to the basketball court, and began playing a game of pickup basketball. And he talked about how all of a sudden these people who could barely move because they were so exhausted when they were working are now out here sweating and playing really, really hard at something they love to do. Why is that? And so he began questioning what makes the difference. And he said part of it is that when people are playing a sport, they're able to keep score. They're able to know, am I winning? Am I losing? Do I need to give more effort? Can I let up a little bit because we're so far ahead? Like, how am I doing? And so that whole book really walks through the premise of making sure that we use scoreboards in our businesses so that people know, are we winning? Are we losing? And how much time is left in the quarter, the month, the year, whatever it is you choose to measure. You've probably all heard this quote before. You can't manage what you don't measure, and you can't measure what you don't monitor. So what is it that you're attempting to manage in your business? Are there areas of your business or within your organization that you can't seem to manage correctly? You're always frustrated by those things. If so, my question to you would be, how are you measuring? How are you actually measuring in that area? Are you measuring? And chances are you're not. Chances are you aren't measuring in that area. And so the challenge to you would be, what can you actually measure? Now, you can't measure what you don't monitor. So it's impossible to measure productivity. It's impossible to measure whatever it may be if you don't have systems in place to monitor those things. So let's just use an example of maybe you want to improve email response times inside your company. So people email in, you want to make sure that you're responding quickly and promptly, and your team is. Well, you can't manage people around that if you don't have a way of measuring that, right? And you can't measure that if there's not some way of monitoring what are the current email response times. And then what is that target? What is that scoreboard that we're aiming for? How are we trying to bring that number, that metric down? Here's some things you need to keep in mind when you build out a scoreboard. They need to be dynamic. What that means is they need to be fluid. They need to change. You need to know the goal of the game before it starts. So when there's a scoreboard, for any sport, every single person knows the goal of the game before it starts. And for businesses, all too often, our players, the people on our team, don't even know the goal of the game before it starts, right? So they just show up and do a job day in and day out without actually knowing what is the goal? What is this thing that we're trying to accomplish? What are we trying to win here? The other thing is players need to know the score during the game. If you are only doing annual, if you're only doing quarterly performance reviews with your team, with people on your team, they don't know the score until it's the end of the quarter, or worse, it's the end of the year if you're doing annual. They need to know the score in real time. That is what they need to be able to figure out. That's why it's got to be dynamic. That way they can change their behavior in order to win. And they need to be able to do that before the time runs out. Before the time runs out. Let's think briefly about ice skating versus ice hockey. So both of them take place on ice. Both of them, at the professional levels, both of them have literally probably spent their lives practicing and playing and rehearsing for what they do. And what is the difference between the two? Well, the difference is hockey has a scoreboard. Hockey has a scoreboard so that the players immediately know if they're behind, they immediately know how much time is left, and they can adjust the way they play based on that. Now, you also think about it, people in the audience, the fans, people watching on TV know who's winning, know who's losing. Now, it's completely different with ice skating. There really isn't a scoreboard until it's too late. So if you think about the way the ice skating works, they go out and do their performance, and then everyone sits by anxiously waiting on the judges to reveal the scores. So the people watching don't know, did they do a phenomenal job? Did they do a terrible job? How does this going to play out? What we do see from being in the audience is that with ice skating, the commentators kind of fill us in. Oh, they kind of messed up here. They had a misstep here. And so that gives us a bit of perspective into how they're doing. But without that, we would be completely clueless until we actually see the end result, until we actually see the score from the judges. So when you think about your business, when you think about your organization, ask yourself, are you building scoreboards kind of based on the ice skating method where they don't know their score until the end of the performance? Or is it more like ice hockey where at any point in time, the players can look up at the scoreboard and immediately know if they're winning or if they are losing? Framework number 6, the next framework we're going to talk about is assets versus actions. Again, as we think about these 7 different frameworks to getting to 7 figures, I think it's important that we understand that you already have frameworks in place. The question is, are you intentional? Have you been intentional with those frameworks? When those frameworks came to be, did they come to be in a state of crisis? In other words, did you adopt a framework because of a crisis, or were you intentional in building out the framework? When you're intentional in these frameworks, you then have control of the direction that your company, your organization heads, regardless of what happens in the world around you. Now, does that mean that every single year is going to be growth and that revenues are going to continually increase every single year and profits are going to get better and better? No, that's not what that means. But what that means is you are now in control, right? You are intentional in the culture that you're building. You're intentional in the way that people are showing up. You're intentional in the way that people are responding to feedback. It's all about intent. So framework number 6, assets versus actions. What is this about? So assets are anything that can be leveraged for growth. Assets, anything that can be leveraged for growth. And then actions doing a thing. It's an act. And this framework is where so many of us get tripped up. We get tripped up with this one in particular because we confuse the two. We confuse assets and actions. And I want to help give you some ways to look at these in a slightly different light, give you some ways to look at these that are a bit different than what you've been thinking. So question one, are we building assets or are we just taking action? Are we building assets or are we just taking action? So again, it's important. Let me go back one slide here. It's important to remember that assets are the things that we can leverage for growth, whereas actions are just doing something, right? They're just doing something. And here's where we get in trouble with this. When we look around, we may look around a competitor and see them doing a certain thing, right? They're taking a certain action. And so we believe, hey, if we go do this certain thing, if we take this same action, we will get the same results that they're getting. And so often that is not the case. What happens is we don't understand the underlying assets that they're either building, our competitors even are building, or that those assets already exist for them. And so the actions that we see are an outflow of those assets. So let me give you a very specific example because I know that's a bit vague. So let's say that you look around and you see a competitor who is constantly putting videos on social media. So they're doing videos on social media. You look around and you say, okay, we need to start doing videos on social media. That would be taking an action. So the way that would sculpt your goal, you may say, okay, they're putting out 3 videos a week. So we're going to start out by doing 2 videos a week. So we've now established a goal, not around an asset, but we've established a goal around what? An action, right? We've established this goal around taking a certain action, 2 videos per week. And when we do that, we end up with a bunch of goals that are all just about taking actions, and none of those goals necessarily lead into or help us build an asset. But if instead we were to step back and say, okay, our competitors putting out 3 videos per week, what are they actually building here? They're building, maybe it's a responsive audience on social media. So if we step back and we say, okay, we want to build, the asset we want to build is a responsive audience on social media, how do we best go about doing that? So for you, that may be different than doing video. If the end goal is to build a responsive audience on social media, the end goal, that's the end goal. The actions that you take may be different than the actions that your competitor's taking, if it is an engaged audience. Does that make sense? So you have to look at the assets that you want to be intentional about building. Now, using the exact same scenario, let's say that you do decide to do video, but you're clear that we want to build an engaged audience. So your goal may go from, instead of saying we're going to publish or we're going to post 2 videos a week on social media, instead the goal may become, we are going to produce content that month 1, we have, 100 engaged people participating in our online video. Month 2, we're going to double that. Month 3, we're going to triple that, right? So again, we shift the focus from the number of videos that we put up to what are the assets? What is the asset that we're actually building? And let's center our goal around that asset. I hope that makes sense because this will fundamentally shift the way that you approach the actions, the activities that you do within your company. Are our actions actually building assets? And the question is, we just talked about this, but which does your scoreboard measure? Does it measure actions taken? In other words, number of videos published on social media, or does it actually measure the performance that we're after, the asset that we're building? Now, let's dive into the very last one. The power of consistency is framework number 7. This is the most anti-entrepreneurial of the 7 frameworks. And the reason I say that is that entrepreneurs, by and large, have left traditional businesses. They've left corporate culture because they want freedom. They want the freedom to choose what they do, when they do it, how they do it, and they don't like the rigidity of corporate structure. And so that's why I say that's the most anti-entrepreneurial of the 7 frameworks, because when we are consistent, consistency creates miracles in your business, in your personal life, in all things. Consistency over time creates miracles. And so I would challenge you as leaders to be consistent in the things that you're bringing to your company. Be consistent in building out your scoreboard. Be consistent in going to the mirror, looking in the mirror every single day. We must be consistent in those things. One book that I recently read, and this is actually the title of the book, is called Personality Isn't Permanent. Personality Isn't Permanent. I highly recommend the book. Dr. Benjamin Hardy's the author of the book. But one of the things he talks about is that oftentimes we embrace certain personas about ourselves, certain personality sentiments about ourselves based on maybe a personality test or based on what we've been told our entire lives. So as entrepreneurs, it's very common for us to believe that we aren't consistent in things, that we love new things, that we love chasing the shiny objects. But I would challenge you to challenge yourself to change that about you, to be consistent. To be consistent in the way that you lead, to be consistent in the way that you grow your organization. One thing about that I would say is this: when I look at our culture and I look at the way we've grown and we've changed over the last several years, what I would say is that consistency has been the catalyst for that. And so let me give you just a few quick examples of how we have been consistent as a company. And these are going to be things that you hear and you're going to say, how have those things actually resulted in the growth? And the answer is, it's not the things themselves, but it's the consistency of doing those things day in, day out, week in, week out, repeating those things over and over again. That helps us build a rhythm. It helps us build that consistency that matters. So for us, every single Monday afternoon from 1:45 to 3 p.m., we have a team meeting. That has been true now for years. And, if I'm being completely honest, there have been a lot of Mondays where there are far more important things, quote unquote, that we could or should be doing. There are far, quote unquote, more important things that deserve our time and attention that day. But we are consistent to that meeting because we know it makes a difference, because we know it helps us all align as a team. And as much as some weeks we don't look forward to it, as much as some weeks we all wish we could skip out on that meeting, we know that it's important to be consistent in that. Another one is every single Tuesday morning, we do one-on-ones. And that is where I meet with the people who report to me directly. And that's where the leaders in the company meet with people who report to them directly. And it's in those one-on-ones that we're able to discuss how things are going towards their goals that they're after, any challenges, any issues. Now, again, for me, this eats up a half day every single week. And I don't always love those things, right? I don't love devoting a half day every single week to those things, but I know it's so important for the culture that we're building. I know it's so important to help them push through, reach certain milestones for the goals that they're after. Another one is we do quarterly team meetings. And this is where we spend, these have grown over the time. They used to be a couple of hours. We're now up to about 5 or 6 hours for these meetings. And this is where we look back over the last quarter. How did we do? We celebrate victories. We celebrate wins. We talk through the challenges where we didn't win. We talk through those things. What did we learn? What did we not learn? And then we look at the future. We look to the next quarter and we say, what do we need to do differently next time? What do we need to do this upcoming quarter? So again, those are just a few ways that we have been intentional. We have been consistent in attempting to bring that into the company, bring that rhythm into our company. So any questions that you may have on these 7 frameworks, let me look here. Just scrolling through the comments. Any questions on this? I know that this isn't, necessarily the most exciting topic in the world. Frameworks are not something, first of all, that are talked about much at all in business. Again, strategies are much more appealing to talk about, and tactics are even, that's the thing that catches everybody's attention. If we were to do a webinar on, how to use Messenger to make millions, or all these little tactics, all these little things that we're doing and trying and we're implementing for our clients, those are the things that are way more exciting to talk about. Those are all the things that get the headlines. Those are all the things that, are kind of sensationalized on social media and in the media. But the question is, for you and I, it's not about chasing those things. The question is, what are the underlying elements? What are the things that are actually the rails that we're going on? What are the frameworks that are in place? Again, we often jump on these new tactics. We love trying the new tactics or trying the new strategies, but without first examining the frameworks that are taking place underneath all of those things, we're never going to end up in a different place. We're always going to end up, no matter the strategy, no matter the tactic, we are always going to end up in the exact same place because we haven't examined the frameworks that are underneath. What are those train tracks? Where are those train tracks actually leading us? And until we take the time, until we pause and reflect on what are the frameworks, what are those train tracks underneath, we cannot, it doesn't matter what you put on top of that. It doesn't matter what strategy you or I drop on top of that. It doesn't matter what new tactic we try. It could be the latest social media platform. None of that matters. What matters is what's underneath it. What is steering our direction forward? So that is why frameworks matter so much. Let's just see here. Anybody else got any questions, comments? Yeah, I agree with you, Mark. It is definitely the most challenging thing. Self-discipline is the key. I mean, that is it. All leadership begins with self-leadership. And as much as I wish that statement weren't true, that statement is true. And, we must go to the mirror. We must look in the mirror and start with us, begin with us. Hey, Cindy, thanks for joining. Yeah. Rhythm and consistency matter a lot in business. We don't often talk about that. We don't often think about that, but we as leaders, it's our responsibility to set the rhythm. It's our responsibility to set kind of the pace of the organization. And it's not talked about enough, in my opinion, the rhythm and pace and the consistency that we create or we don't create, that we ignore. It has a lot of impact on everything else. And that's why, again, that each of these frameworks are so important to examine and to look at. Thanks, Patricia. So glad that you joined as well. And good luck with the new team that you're working with. Let me leave you with just a couple of quick resources, additional places to go. Again, so much of what I've shared today, I've taken and adapted from other people. One is any book by Chuck Kunrent. The Game of Work is probably the best one to start with. The Game of Work. Another one, which I haven't read, but looks really promising. I think it's called The Speed of Trust, if I'm not mistaken. It's by, maybe it's Sean Covey. It's Stephen Covey's son. I haven't read it, but listened to a podcast or two about it, and it's phenomenal. Trying to think of any other resources. Those would be two great ones to start with. I led with Michael Gerber's quote about, our business is really just a reflection of us. So his books are E-Myth and E-Myth Revisited, both of those books. Yep, sure, Patricia. I'll put a comment here as well with the books and the authors' names. Actually, tell you what, I'll drop a link to those books so you can just go directly to those. And then another resource that I would highly recommend for you is John Maxwell has a leadership podcast, John Maxwell Leadership Podcast, and highly recommend that podcast. It's about once a week, give or take, maybe a little bit more than that. I highly recommend that. It's very challenging, very good podcast to listen to. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day. Hope the rest of your week goes well. Hope you have a great weekend. I know here in Central Louisiana, it's supposed to be beautiful the rest of the weekend or rest of the week. Not today. Today it's supposed to be cloudy and rainy, but this weekend it's supposed to be gorgeous outside. So I hope you're able to get outside and enjoy it. And again, thank you so much for taking the time. If you have any questions, contact information, my email address is here. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much.